The Night the Sky Fought Back. Act 1, When the World Burned. The year was 1939. Europe was collapsing one nation at a time, like dominoes arranged by fate itself. Poland fell in just 27 days. The Polish cavalry charged tanks with sabers drawn, brave and desperate and doomed. Warsaw burned while the world watched in horror, realizing that this war would be different from anything history had ever seen. Belgium fell next. The fortress of Ebenemehl, supposedly impregnable, supposedly the guardian of the Low Countries, was taken in less than 24 hours by German glider troops who landed silently on its roof like ghosts. Holland fell in 5 days. Rotterdam was bombed so viciously that the city center ceased to exist. Smoke rose so high it could be seen from England across the Channel. Denmark fell in 6 hours. 6 hours. A nation extinguished before most of its citizens had finished breakfast. Norway fought longer, but still fell. British and French forces tried to help, but it was like throwing buckets of water at a forest fire. And then came France. France, the great military power of Europe. France, whose Maginot Line was supposed to be unbreakable. France, who had fought Germany to a bloody stalemate for 4 years in the previous war. France fell in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The world couldn't believe it. Politicians in Washington sat stunned. Generals in London stared at maps they could no longer trust. Stalin in Moscow began to sweat, wondering if he had made a deal with a monster he couldn't control. Everywhere Hitler's army marched, he carried one invisible weapon with him, more powerful than any tank, more terrifying than any artillery barrage. The skies. The Luftwaffe. Thousands of German aircraft, sleek, fast, deadly, ruling the air like metal predators circling wounded prey. Stuka dive bombers screaming down from the clouds with sirens attached to their landing gear, a sound designed specifically to break the human spirit. The wail of the Jericho trumpet, they called it. Men who heard it said it sounded like the gates of hell opening. Messerschmitt 109 slicing through the sky like silver knives, faster than anything the Allies could field, piloted by men who had been training for this war since they were teenagers. Dornier bombers flying in perfect formation, dropping their payloads with mechanical precision. Heinkel bombers that could reach any target in Western Europe and return home before the sun set. No one had seen air power like this before. Tanks were important, Guderian's panzers proved that. Infantry was important, the Wehrmacht was the most disciplined force on earth. But Hitler understood something other dictators hadn't, something that military strategists were only beginning to grasp. Win the sky, and the earth will fall beneath it. Control the air, and you control the battlefield. Control the air, and you control which cities live and which cities die. Control the air, and you control the future itself. By mid-1940, Hitler had one last obstacle before total victory in Europe. Britain. A small island. Foggy. Damp. Stubborn. Led by a man with a cigar and a growl, Winston Churchill, who had just become Prime Minister and had promised his people nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Hitler looked across the English Channel, just 21 miles of water, and saw the final prize. And he intended to crush Britain the same way he had crushed everyone else. From the air. Act 2, The Night the Sky Turned Red. August 1940. London lay quiet beneath a silver blue moon, the kind of moon that made the River Thames glow like liquid mercury. Children slept in basements that had been converted into makeshift shelters, their parents' coats piled on top of them as blankets. Some clutched teddy bears. Others clutched each other. Mothers kept emergency bags by the door, a change of clothes, important documents, a tin of biscuits, a photograph of their husband if he was away at war. Everything that mattered, compressed into one small bag. Church bells were silenced to avoid panic. The bells would only ring now for one reason: invasion. If you heard church bells ringing across England, it meant German troops had landed. Fathers who were too old to fight joined the Home Guard, drilling with broomsticks because there weren't enough rifles to go around. They practiced defending their neighborhoods against an army that had conquered all of Europe. The children had been evacuated months ago, millions of them, sent from the cities to the countryside, away from their parents, clutching name tags and gas masks. They rode trains into the unknown, watching their mothers grow smaller on the platforms, wondering if they would ever see home again. At 4:43 p.m. on September 7, 1940, radar operators along the English coast saw something they'd never seen before. Not dozens of enemy planes. Not hundreds. But over 1,000. A black cloud of steel stretching 20 miles wide, moving together like a single living creature, like a swarm of locusts heading toward a harvest. The radar operator, a young woman named Elizabeth Webb, stared at her screen and felt her blood go cold. She picked up the phone to call her commander, and her hand was shaking. "Sir," she whispered. "Sir, you need to see this." Hitler had launched his greatest attack. The Blitz. The word came from Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And like lightning, it struck without mercy. Bombs rained over London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Coventry, Manchester, Southampton, Bristol, Cardiff. Every major city. Every port. Every factory town. High explosive bombs that could collapse entire apartment buildings. Incendiary bombs that burned so hot they melted steel. Parachute mines that drifted down silently and then detonated with enough force to destroy an entire block. Factories burned until the sky itself seemed to be on fire. Workers ran from buildings that moments before had been their livelihood. The smell of burning rubber, burning wood, burning flesh. Railway lines twisted like melted wire, turned into abstract sculptures by the heat of explosions. Homes collapsed in firestorms that created their own weather systems, winds so strong they sucked people into the flames. St. Paul's Cathedral stood surrounded by fire, its dome rising above the destruction like a symbol of defiance. Photographers captured it, and the image became iconic, faith standing firm while the world burned. And still, the German bombers kept coming. Night after night. Week after week. Month after month. 457 consecutive nights, London was bombed. Not a single night of rest. Not a single night of peace. People learned to sleep through explosions. Children learned to do their homework in bomb shelters. More than 40,000 British civilians would die in the Blitz. Half of them in London alone. Hitler believed this. Break their cities, break their spirit, the British will surrender. It was a logical assumption. It had worked everywhere else. Why wouldn't it work here? But something unexpected happened. They didn't. Even as fire consumed the streets. Even as night skies glowed orange with destruction. Even as families were torn apart and neighborhoods ceased to exist. Britain refused to bow. The King and Queen stayed in London, refusing to evacuate. When Buckingham Palace was bombed, Queen Elizabeth said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face." People emerged from bomb shelters each morning and went to work. They stepped over rubble. They walked past buildings that were still smoking. They queued for rations as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Signs appeared in shop windows, more open than usual. Graffiti appeared on walls, "London can take it." But resistance alone wouldn't win the war. Hope alone wouldn't stop the bombs. Someone had to strike back. And so, in the dimly lit airfields scattered across England, a new kind of warfare was born. A warfare that would eventually, finally, stop Hitler's attack. A warfare that would take the fight not to the battlefield, but to the very source of Hitler's power. Act 3, The Bombers Who Flew When Hope Was Gone. At a lonely RAF station in Lincolnshire, rain hammered against the corrugated metal roofs of the hangars like 1,000 tiny fists. Inside, ground crews worked frantically to prepare the bombers for tonight's mission. They loaded bombs, each one weighing hundreds of pounds, into the aircraft bellies using chain hoists and muscle and determination. They checked fuel lines, tested engines, patched bullet holes from the last mission with aluminum plates and prayers. A young pilot named Arthur Hawke Harrison stood near his aircraft, tightening his leather gloves against the cold. He was 24 years old. He looked 40. His face was gaunt, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. None of them had. Hawke, his crewmate shouted over the wind, rain dripping from his cap, "You're flying into hell tonight." Hawke smiled, that small, tired smile pilots give when they know the odds and go anyway. The smile of men who have already made peace with their mortality. "Hell's already here," he whispered, looking up at the sky where German bombers had passed just hours before. "We just take it back to them." He climbed into a massive aircraft, the Avro Lancaster, a 4-engine heavy bomber that would become legendary. The Lancaster was beautiful in the way that instruments of war could be beautiful. Sleek, powerful, purposeful. It could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs deep into Germany and return home. Usually, the survival rate for bomber crews was brutal. 50%. Flip a coin, that was your chance of completing a full tour of duty. 30 missions. Most crews didn't make it past 15. Behind Hawke sat his crew, the 6 other men who would share his fate tonight. The navigator, Harris, a former school teacher whose maps were covered in greasy pencil lines and coffee stains. He could calculate wind drift and fuel consumption in his head faster than most men could do it with a slide rule. His wife had just had a baby, a daughter he'd only seen in photographs. The flight engineer, Thompson, who monitored the 4 Merlin engines, watching temperatures and pressures and fuel levels like a doctor monitoring vital signs. He could hear problems in an engine before the instruments showed them. The bomb aimer, Miller, who would lie flat in the nose of the aircraft during the attack, peering through the bomb sight, his face inches from the perspex, watching the target grow larger and larger until the exact moment of release. He had been an architect before the war. Now he destroyed buildings instead of designing them. The wireless operator, Finch, a former shopkeeper who now sent coded messages over crackling airwaves, his Morse key tapping out letters that meant the difference between life and death. He was 19 years old, the youngest of the crew. The mid-upper gunner, Lewis, whose turret rotated 360 degrees, giving him a view of the sky in all directions. He sat cramped in a perspex bubble with 4 machine guns and 1,000 rounds of ammunition. He had shot down 3 German fighters. 3 small swastikas painted on the side of his turret. He never celebrated the kills. Each one was someone's son. The rear gunner, Drake, who sat in the most exposed, most dangerous position on the aircraft, the tail. Alone in the darkness, separated from the rest of the crew, watching behind them for the fighters that hunted them. Rear gunners had the lowest survival rate of any aircrew position. Drake was on his 23rd mission. He was both incredibly lucky and living on borrowed time. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary darkness. Harris had taught geography to school children. Thompson had fixed motorcycles. Miller had drawn houses. Finch had sold fabric. Lewis had worked on his father's farm. Drake had been a postal worker. Now they flew into the heart of Nazi Germany and tried to destroy it. At 22:18 hours, the runway lights flickered once, the signal. All across the airfield, engines roared to life. The sound was deafening, like thunder that never ended. The Lancaster's 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines let out a roar that shook the earth, that rattled the windows of the control tower, that could be heard in the village 3 miles away. One by one, the bombers lifted into the night. Hawk pushed the throttles forward. The Lancaster accelerated down the runway, heavily laden with bombs and fuel, reluctant to leave the earth. Faster. Faster. The end of the runway approaching. And then, the nose lifted. Up. 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 Into the same skies the Luftwaffe had dominated for years. Only this time, the sky would fight back. Act 4, the attack on the beating heart of Hitler's war machine. The key to Hitler's unstoppable attacks wasn't just his soldiers, wasn't just his tanks, wasn't just his brilliant generals. It wasn't even Hitler himself. It was something hidden deep inside Germany, something the German people saw every day but took for granted. The factories. The oil refineries that turned crude petroleum into aviation fuel, diesel, gasoline, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, producing the precision components that went into every aircraft, every tank, every vehicle. Without ball bearings, the entire war machine would grind to a halt. The steelworks in the Ruhr Valley, forging the armor plating that protected German tanks, the gun barrels that armed them, the rails that transported them. The aircraft production lines where Messerschmitts and Heinkels and Focke-Wulfs were assembled by thousands of workers in 24-hour shifts. The chemical plants producing synthetic rubber, explosives, even synthetic fuel from coal. The submarine pens on the Atlantic coast, concrete fortresses where U-boats were built and repaired before heading out to strangle Britain's supply lines. The very heart that pumped life into the Nazi war engine. As long as those factories lived, Hitler's armies could keep fighting forever. They could replace every tank destroyed, every aircraft shot down, every ship sunk, every soldier killed. The production lines would simply make more. And so the Allies formed a new strategy, controversial and brutal and desperately necessary. Don't fight the claws. Strike the heart. Destroy the factories, the fuel, the power, the supply chains. Destroy the infrastructure that allowed Hitler to wage war. If the Luftwaffe couldn't refuel, couldn't replace aircraft, couldn't build bombs, Hitler's attack would finally crumble. So began the most dangerous missions of the war. Strategic bombing raids into the very core of Nazi Germany. Berlin, the capital, Hitler's showcase city, defended by hundreds of flak towers and night fighter squadrons. Hamburg, the great port city where U-boats were built. The Allies would eventually create a firestorm there so intense it killed 40,000 people in a single night. Essen, home of the Krupp Steel Works, forging the weapons of war for over a century. Kiel, where the mighty battleships and submarines of the Kriegsmarine were constructed. Dresden, a cultural center that would become one of the most controversial bombing targets of the war. Schweinfurt, where half of Germany's ball bearings were produced. 2 raids there would cost the Americans 60 bombers in a single week. Ploesti, the Romanian oil fields that provided Germany with most of its petroleum. One of the bloodiest air battles of the war. Places so heavily defended that pilots called them the gates of death. The Germans knew these factories were vital. They ringed them with flak towers, massive concrete structures bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Some had more than 100 guns firing simultaneously. The sky above a German industrial city didn't just have anti-aircraft fire, it had a solid wall of exploding metal. They stationed night fighter squadrons nearby, pilots who specialized in hunting bombers in the dark, using radar, searchlights, and eventually even upward-firing cannons to catch the British aircraft from below. They used searchlights to illuminate the bombers, hundreds of searchlights that could turn night into day, making the aircraft perfect targets. They even used decoy cities, fake towns built in empty fields with electric lights and fake factories, hoping to trick the bombers into wasting their payload on nothing. Tonight, Hawk and his crew were headed to one of the most important targets. The Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany. The Ruhr produced more coal than any other place in Europe. More steel than Britain and France combined. It was the beating heart of Hitler's war machine. And tonight, they were going to try to stop it. Act 5, Through the Nightmare of the Skies. The Lancaster shuddered as it crossed the Dutch coastline at 18,000 feet. Below them, waves crashed against the shore, invisible in the darkness except for occasional glints of moonlight on the water. Above them, searchlights clawed at the sky like white swords, sweeping back and forth, hunting for them. And somewhere ahead, somewhere in that darkness, the black swarm of German night fighters waited. "Enemy radar has us," Finch whispered into the intercom, his voice tight with fear. His radio had picked up the telltale signals of German radar stations tracking them across occupied Europe. "We're not turning back," Hawk answered. His voice was steady. The steadiness was a lie, but his crew needed to hear it. They flew in formation with dozens of other bombers, a stream of aircraft stretching across the night sky. Safety in numbers. Or so the theory went. The reality was more complicated. The Germans had learned to track the bomber streams, to position their fighters along the route, to pick off the stragglers one by one. Within minutes, the first attack came. A Messerschmitt Bf-110 slashed across the Lancaster's tail, appearing out of nowhere like a shark rising from dark water. Machine guns lit the sky with flaming tracer rounds, red, green, white, beautiful and deadly. "Gunner! On your right!" Hawk shouted. Drake, in the rear turret, swung his guns around, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the fear singing in his veins. He squeezed the triggers. The 4.303 Browning machine guns roared, sending streams of bullets into the darkness. Lewis fired burst after burst from the mid-upper turret, until flames erupted from the German plane and it spiraled downward into darkness, leaving a trail of fire behind it. But there was no time to breathe. No time to celebrate. Flak towers opened fire from the ground below. Explosions tore the night apart. Black clouds of shrapnel bloomed around the Lancaster like deadly flowers. Each burst sounded like someone slamming a hammer against the fuselage. The plane shook violently as shrapnel ripped through the wings, puncturing the aluminum skin, narrowly missing the fuel tanks. Harris clung to his maps, his calculations, trying to keep them on course. Finch tried to stabilize the radio, which had been damaged by a fragment of shrapnel that had punched through the fuselage and missed his head by inches. Drake prayed under his breath, not to survive, but to finish the mission. Because they knew one thing, the one thing that kept them flying into this hell night after night. If they stopped Hitler's factories today, Hitler's bombs would stop falling tomorrow. The children sleeping in London basements would be safe. The mothers waiting by their doors could finally rest. The war, this endless, grinding war, might finally end. Act 6, The Battle Above Germany. The deeper they flew into Germany, the worse it became. They were over the Ruhr now, Happy Valley, the bomber crews called it, with bitter irony. There was nothing happy about it. Altitude dropping. Harris shouted. "We've lost the starboard outer engine." Black smoke poured from the number 4 engine, streaming behind them like a banner of defeat. Thompson hit the fire extinguisher, and the flames died, but the engine was dead weight now, creating drag, making the aircraft harder to control. The aircraft began to tilt to the right. Hawk fought the controls, his muscles straining, trimming the aircraft to compensate for the dead engine. But they pressed forward, toward the lights of the Ruhr. Toward the most heavily defended industrial zone in Europe. Below them stretched a landscape of fire. Refineries with their towers and pipes and tanks. Power plants with their chimneys pumping smoke into the night sky. Steel mills with their blast furnaces glowing red like the eyes of demons. All glowing red with war production, all working around the clock to feed Hitler's insatiable war machine. And all defended by more anti-aircraft guns than anywhere else on Earth. German anti-aircraft guns thundered from every direction. 88mm flak cannons that could put a shell at 25,000 feet in seconds. The sky turned into a solid wall of explosions. Each burst sent thousands of white-hot metal fragments spraying outward. Target in sight. Harris cried. Ahead, barely visible through the flak and smoke, was their target, a massive synthetic oil plant. Destroying it would cost Germany thousands of gallons of fuel per day. Fuel that panzer divisions needed. Fuel that Luftwaffe fighters needed. Fuel that the entire Nazi war effort depended on. Hawk steadied the bomber, fighting to hold it level despite the dead engine, despite the flak, despite everything. Bomb doors open, he commanded. Miller, lying in the nose, pressed the button. The aircraft lurched as the doors groaned apart beneath them. Wind howled through the cabin, a freezing gale at 18,000 feet. Miller peered through his bomb sight, watching the target slide into the crosshairs, making tiny adjustments. Steady, steady. Flak tore past their windows. A night fighter dove at them like a meteor, traces streaming. Lewis fired back, his turret rotating, guns blazing. The fighter broke away, damaged, trailing smoke. Steady. The aircraft shuddered from another flak burst, closer this time. A fragment punched through the fuselage near Finch, and he felt the wind on his face where a moment before there had been metal. Release. Hawk shouted. Miller pressed the release toggle. A second of silence. A second that felt like eternity. Then the bombs fell. A string of high explosives, each one tumbling through the clouds, falling toward the factories that fed Hitler's relentless attack. Miller counted them falling. Bombs gone. Bomb doors closed. Hawk banked the aircraft hard to the left, beginning the long journey home. Below them, the world exploded. A flash. Then another. Then a rising wave of fire that climbed into the sky like a living thing. Secondary explosions as fuel tanks erupted. A mushroom cloud of flame and smoke. They had hit the target. Direct hit. The synthetic oil plant was burning. But their nightmare was only beginning. Act 7, the longest journey home. 2 engines out now. Thompson shouted. We're losing altitude. The starboard inner engine had failed, killed by battle damage. They were flying on 2 engines now, the aircraft struggling, losing height. And they were still over Germany. Still in the heart of enemy territory. Still hundreds of miles from safety. German fighters circled them like wolves sensing wounded prey. Drake fired until his guns ran out of ammunition. Lewis kept firing, conserving rounds, taking careful shots. They dropped to 15,000 feet. Then 12,000. Then 10,000. The Dutch coast appeared ahead, freedom, or at least the promise of it. They crossed at 8,000 feet, barely above the flak range, the aircraft barely flying. Behind them, fires still burned across the Ruhr. The factories they had bombed would be out of commission for weeks, maybe months. The oil would not flow. The steel would not be forged. The war machine would slow, just a little. And tomorrow night, other crews would fly this same mission. And the night after that. And the night after that. Until finally, years from now, the factories would stop forever. The bomber stream flew home through the dawn. Some aircraft would not make it. Some crews would be lost over the North Sea, their engines failing, their fuel exhausted. But Hawk kept flying. Kept fighting the controls. Kept bringing his crew home. The English coast appeared in the morning light. The most beautiful sight any of them had ever seen. They landed on a runway that was cratered from the previous night's German bombing. Ground crews ran to meet them, shocked they had made it back. The Lancaster's fuselage was riddled with holes. 2 engines were destroyed. The tail was barely attached. "How did you fly this thing home?" a ground crew chief asked in awe. Hawk climbed out, exhausted, shaking, alive. He looked at his crew, all of them alive, all of them home. "Because," he said quietly, "they're still bombing London. And tomorrow night, we go back." And they did. Night after night. Until the war was won.